shoulders back, standing tall. Walking down the street, he may not be perfect, but he's complete. Family safe at home, while he's facing the concrete, slowly slips away. Another crime, another day. He wanted to breathe easier, but they took that away. We all want to breathe easier. Don't you think we could someday? Maybe not tomorrow, but someday. Thank you.
All right, Stacy, you should be good to screen share now.
Okay. Everyone, on behalf of ArtsNow, I want to thank you for joining ArtsNow Presents. We're so excited to have you all here, and we are very, very excited to welcome renowned artist and environmentalist Stacy Levy to Summit County virtually. I want to take a quick moment to thank our partners and co-hosts in this effort, the Akron Zoo, the City of Cuyahoga Falls, City of Akron, Conservancy for the Cuyahoga Valley National Park, Great Lakes Biomimicry, Summit MetroParks, and the University of Akron Biomimicry and Innovation Center. One thing that we do exceptionally well in Summit County is collaboration, and we are at such a unique and important place nationally in the conversation of art and environment, and that intersection has always been important to us, and so we're thrilled to lean into that a little bit tonight. So for all of you who are here in the Zoom room, I hope you'll enjoy the presentation and certainly be thinking of questions for Stacy and join me in trying to talk her into coming to Summit County in the near future. We're love having her here. And for those of you on Facebook Live, please share and try to engage more of the community in this really exciting and important and timely conversation for Summit County. So at this point, I want to take just a moment to give you a little bit of background about Stacy. Stacy is an artist who works with rain, urban tides, and watersheds. Her projects give a home to rain on many sites, from parking lots to nature centers. Her installations on tidal rivers give people a sense of amplitude and timing of the tides in cities. She also works to make visible how watersheds are capillaries from the land, carrying precious rainwater from the sky to the sea. She has created temporary and permanent works in Philadelphia, New York, Seattle, Phoenix, Tampa, Miami, and San Antonio and Fayetteville. She often collaborates with engineers, ecologists, and landscape architects to make artwork that helps to solve simple site issues like stormwater runoff, water pollution, and stream bank erosion. Stacy graduated from Yale University, majoring in art and forestry. She got her MFA from Tyler School of Art at Temple University. She attended a year at the Architectural Association in London and began her work as an urban forester in the Mid-Atlantic region. She's been working as an eco-relevatory artist in the public realm for 29 years. Stacy's been awarded the Henry Meigs Environmental Leadership Award, Penn Future Award for Women in Conservation, and a Pew Fellowship in the Arts. It is several years in the making, and with great excitement that I welcome Stacy Levy to our conversation today. Thank you, Stacy. I'll let you take it away.
I have to unmute. Hi. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Grace. And thanks everyone who's here tonight. I really appreciate you all coming to hear me. This is the first of 3 lectures that I'm giving. And this one is much more about how art can reveal and make legible ecology, how nature works, and a real translator of nature. Next week, I'll be talking about how art can actually solve certain problems with in waterways, in particular with infiltration or water pollution. So we'll be going from a kind of observing to more active sort of work. So tonight, I also want to do a sense of where we all are. I want to acknowledge that I'm currently living on land stolen from the Susquehannock and the Shawnee, who were displaced by European settlers in the 1700s. And that we are mindful of a history of broken treaties and grateful for the opportunity to steward this land for many species besides human species, by managing this acreage of land that I happen to live on, managing for biodiversity. I'm in the watershed of the Muddy Creek, which connects to Penns Creek, that flows into the Susquehanna River, which moves into the Chesapeake Bay. And so I wanted to take a moment and think of who once lived on the land, and also the interconnectivity of the watersheds flowing around us, some of them encumbered under cities and some of them flowing freely. So we'll start with that. And thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to jump in and start talking about my work. That's what you'll be seeing, and sort of the angle that I'm taking in what I'm doing. Yeah, let's make sure. Kim now. All right, we are screen sharing, and for some reason my computer is not responding to moving forward. Let's see what's going on here. Here we go. It may be a tad slow. So I find in this modern era, and I don't know exactly when this began, but understanding the natural world is really missing from our lives. We just don't know where we are in our own backyards. And in most places, most times when we see a landscape, we don't quite understand what's going on in that landscape. We can't read where we are. And my feeling is that can be very frustrating, to be so uncertain of how nature works. And it contributes to a loss of a relationship. Just like if you didn't understand the person you lived with, over time you'd lose a certain connectivity. And we're losing that sense of how plants are different from each other, how animals are interacting with our world, their world too, how food webs work, and how the water cycle works. And I often feel like it's like we're walking around like cooking in someone else's kitchen. We don't know where anything is anymore. And I think that's a big problem that we have, because it gives us a certain anxiety and a certain feeling of disconnectedness. So I'm often thinking about how we can make our relationship to nature stronger and particularly more inclusive, and more accessible and more everyday. So if you're at the bus stop, you have a sense of nature. If you're parking your car, or better, you're chaining up your bike, you have a sense of nature around you. It isn't just for people who get to go to national parks. Nature is something that's happening everywhere. And I feel that we should have an awareness of it wherever we are. And I think art plays a really important role to forge a deeper relationship, to really bring us closer to nature and ecology. And it's tool for making nature legible. For those of us who sat in bio class and maybe didn't get it, or sat in chemistry class and didn't always get it, art is a different way into our brain for explaining things. And it creates a very visceral connection to nature. And that is that new way in, or that different way in, isn't very much part of how we get most of our information about nature through science. So I think that arts has a very strong role to play to explain and reveal. Communicating science is extremely important. I think it's as important as science itself right now, because if science is being done and it's not being communicated, it's almost as if it's not happening, which is basically the entire 1970s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s of climate change science, which when I was in forestry school, we whispered about, but didn't talk about it. It was not well communicated. And part of our predicament is because people just didn't know. That's for all sorts of reasons that we could have hours of talk about, but it's a very interesting idea that not knowing also makes things not happen. And it's so that kind of communication is something we've been missing and we really need more of, but not in the form of charts and graphs. I think we need more of a hands-on, visceral, full sort of body experience so that other kinds of learners can get into this understanding of ecology. And the idea that we're trying to bring art and science together is something that's really important, because art is an excellent storyteller for how science works. And science is not always such a good storyteller for itself. So this idea that art and science should hold hands to reveal these natural systems that are everywhere in the world that we live in. They're in the wilds, and they're also in urban nature too. So nature's happening everywhere. No matter how much glass and concrete there is, there's still nature happening throughout our cities. It's interesting to think about how art was once the primary method of showing and exploring nature. This is Albert Durr in 1500, and he's looking very closely at a patch in a meadow to see the different plants and how they're growing. And that kind of showing nature was the job of scientists and artists together. Scientists were not differentiated at this point. Leonardo da Vinci wasn't considered a scientist. He was considered a philosophical thinker. And often scientists and artists were the same people. Slowly, though, as we industrialized, we gained new forms of observation, primarily photography, which really changed our perception of nature. And it is the sort of, I think photography is sort of considered the child of science and art. And it is a very interesting thing that it combines those two ways of thinking. But as we departed from the world of visual images as a way to explain the natural world, and began to move towards abstraction, we started to lose something, a kind of innate understanding that you could just get by looking at art that explained nature. As science took over, our sense of what was what started to diminish a little bit. If you think of going from those wonderful figures of the constellations, and then it becomes sort of a series of dots, which you can lose interest in fairly quickly, unless you're trained to read these. So most of nature these days is translated by science, the language of science. And it's a language that you do have to learn. Reading a graph is not something you're born doing. And the information that's presented with graphs and charts doesn't always make a lot of sense to people and doesn't stick in our minds. So I'm trying to think of a different way of presenting and exploring and revealing nature that is as true as the science, but comes into you from a different angle. And I think art's very important because it's giving people handholds, clues, these kind of explanations about what nature is doing around us. And it's a different kind of translation. Science is but a translation of nature. Science is a translation of nature, and art is another kind of translation of nature. So I'm hoping that we can use art to expand on ways to reveal our relationship with nature and really tell the story of how nature works. There's always a feeling that somehow all our problems will be solved by technology, and that we no longer need the natural world because we're going to sort of supersede it with our technology. But Doug Tallamy writes, we must be very wary, very wary of the claims that our future needs will be met by technology, that we no longer require the natural systems and the interrelationships that they comprise. I have been concentrating on the importance of the interrelationships, that we actually need a relationship with nature and we can't live without it, even though we've tried. We're part of the natural world, and being segregated from it, as sometimes we think we are if we live in the cities, oh, we're far from nature, we don't have to have anything to do with it. We're completely wrong. We're still drinking the water and breathing the air that is nature. And so we need to continue to have a real relationship with nature, or we'll be completely lost in our own backyards. But nature's a little tricky. It can be hard to get. It can be too small, like microorganisms, diatoms here, the essential bottom of the food web. It can be too vast, such as watersheds that are coursing throughout our neighborhoods and beyond, and are very hard to kind of get a sense of. Sometimes natural processes are just moving too fast. The patterns of water movement, they're quick and ephemeral, really hard to capture, hard to think about. Sometimes things are moving simply too slowly, like the tide. It's very hard to see the tides changing unless you are marking a point with chalk or something. Sometimes at the beach, you can see the tide changing, but as you drive past a tidal river in a city, it's very hard to tell where the tide is. There's not much that's registering it. And sometimes the ecology of a site is too old and we're unable to recapture it or understand it because it's visually hidden by the structure of the city, such as the streams that run under our urban grids. That kind of hardness to trace how streams connect to larger waterways like the Chesapeake Bay. It took me a while when I moved out to central Pennsylvania to realize, even though I'm 3.5 hours from the bay, my waterway, my rain that drops on my roof connects all the way down to the Chesapeake Bay. And it took me a while to figure that one out. And I'm someone who's very interested in water. So it takes a long time for people to understand these relationships. And I think art can be very helpful. So I'm going to be looking about how art can help translate ecology in everyday places and how it can make nature much more legible and then present in our lives. Because if you can read it, you can think about it more and you can feel it as you pass by. You might live in a city that you can understand the urban tides. One pattern that I'm particularly fond of, and I love to try and reveal, is the pattern of fluid dynamics, how liquids and gases move. And one of the most beautiful patterns that this makes is the Kármán vortex street from vortex shedding. This is basically how water moves when it hits, say, a bridge pier or a stick or a soda bottle. And this pattern of flow is pervasive throughout nature. Here's a study of it in ocean currents. That's the East Coast and that kind of ochre color to the upper left. And in the winds on the planet Jupiter's eye has wonderful vortexes. And even in our cups of tea, when we're stirring milk or of any sort into it, you can see those vortexes. So it's just at every scale in our lives. So I'm always working on how to bring these essential patterns into our everyday spaces. I think we need to know these patterns and run over them or bike around them. So I'm interested in how you can make that kind of pattern visceral and allow people to play in it. And here these girls are climbing on hydrologically curved walls and riding their bikes around Kármán vortex streets. So this idea that you can make places where people can experience the patterns of ecology that are happening around them in their everyday backyard kind of situations seems like a very important role for art to take. And these lessons, they're kinetic, they're experiential, we're feeling them with our bodies. And the swirling walls in this park in San Antonio, Texas, are giving a sense of the river's movement without getting wet, without swimming, without the danger of being in a river with a varying current. So it's a kind of primer on how water works. But it is to be remembered that, and most of my work, it's not built by art alone. These larger projects are collaborations with land and building architects, planners and engineers, ecologists and educators do a lot of programming with me that lives on the site. Some do not require much more than myself, but most of them always require some kind of research with at least an ecologist, and a lot of them are working with engineers. It really often takes a team to build something. In this case, I'm bringing the patterns of the mission architecture and the patterns of the river water together. So you can see how these floral patterns from the 16 and 1700s are also strangely related to the vortices of the river patterns. Artists have long looked very closely at nature and described nature carefully. And they've been as astute in their observations as scientists. And also artists often work with scientists. We often collaborate together, as well as collaborating with engineers and land and building architects. So I'm thinking about how these forms become part of the architecture, how these natural forms of say water's flow can make a place that you can stand in. And natural forms and designs have often gone hand in hand throughout history. I've been discovering how Art Nouveau patterns are really quite resonant of hydrologic patterns. We can see this. There's a photograph of a Carmen vortex street, and there are some patterns of Art Nouveau that probably maybe these artists watched water swirling in the Seine or down their drains, but these are extremely accurate hydrological flow patterns. And in order to see these ever moving patterns, I'm often enlarging them and freezing them so that they stay still, so you can kind of get what's going on. I was looking at ancient Egyptian columns, which are also a form of turning the local ecology into ornament. The patterns of the local vegetation are made apparent through the architecture. And I think that's a really interesting thing that we're often capturing in our architecture. We're often capturing our natural world that is just outside of the architecture. So capturing this movement of nature is something, there's a repeated theme in my work. In this case, this is at the Ontario Science Center. I'm trying to bring stream geomorphology, basically the shape of streams and why they look that way, into a kind of everyday experience at the Science Museum in Toronto. And here, this piece is translating how streams work with meanders and point bars and stream bank hydrology. So it gives us a kind of touchstone for recognizing these patterns that are everywhere, from our pouring cream into our coffee to in the oceans and in weather maps of hurricanes. There's a long tradition of art freezing that moment to make it visible so that we can really spend time watching it, and then we'll be able to know it better when we see it in action. And I love the idea that you can walk and skip and run on top of an actual diagram. So my artworks are indeed artworks, but they're kind of a living diagram showing how the flow works and the point bars, very similar to a drawn textbook diagram, which is a wonderful way of expressing things, but also this is in a textbook. I want to bring these sort of diagrams to under our feet, to the outdoors, sometimes to right next to what they're explaining, and creating diagrams that you can run in and walk in. So There are also parts of our local nature that need a kind of different, or they need an introduction, because the beauty of them is not readily available to us when we see them in their live scale. They're kind of mushy or smelly or too tiny. And so I'm very interested in, how do you bring the microorganism work into light? And I do a lot of work with these fairly transparent, tiny, tiny, floating or stuck to the bottom of the pier critters that inhabit our world, and we just don't know. So I love the idea of that your microscopic neighbors are at your feet too, and you can get a sense of what those extraordinary patterns of architecture that their bodies have in them. The beauty of how the invisible world is put together is something that's very inspiring. And so bringing it to people's feet is very important. But we see these forms in textbooks, but I want to put the textbook into the city street and take these incredible forms that you can see in a microscope, but we're not all carrying microscopes around, and bring them into this everyday view. So out, sort of taking this view outside of the science lab and making it happen so you can see it while you're waiting for the bus or walking down the street. Learning about other species in our shared world is really important, but like the mushy things of algae, there's a lot of other ones that we're not immediately attracted to, such as mold. But the patterns of mold, when you get to see them up close, are really extraordinarily beautiful. I consider them microflorals, and they are not only beautiful, but they're absolutely essential to our world. We would be piled, 60 feet in the air if we didn't have mold to break things down. These are a way of kind of making peace with mold in a certain way, because I'm very interested in how you make all of the natural world into something that's intriguing rather than grotesque to us. Here's Aspergillus mold on a strawberry, which normally you'd be like, oh, that's awful. But when you start to know the pattern of that, and those are like thousands of tiny, tiny flowers on the strawberry, they become far more intriguing, and you get to know the idea of mold and what it's doing. I knew that I was successful when my kids started running up to me with moldy cantaloupe saying, look at this, instead of, ew, disgusting. So this idea of creating a sense of wonder by opening up the visual world of nature is something I'm really interested in, and how art can translate ecology. Artists and scientists have been translating ecology, and here's Heikel, who introduced human society to microorganisms and drew these very elaborate, beautiful drawings, highly stylized, very Victorian styles, to show this architecture that he was discovering with his teams by dragging nets through the ocean. These creatures had never been seen before they put them under the microscope, the new invention of the microscope, and started to take a look at them. And people were just thrilled by this world they had never known, this natural world that hadn't been available to their eyes, it hadn't been translated to them. And microarchitecture of radiolarias were scaled up hugely to make human architecture at various sort of World's Fair pavilions, which I just love, that people were inspired by the microscopic to make something. So I've also been inspired by the microscopic and created some things with microalgae, the diatoms, which are the mussels' lunch. And getting people to get close and to see this invisible world in a new way is very interesting to me. This is actually part of a freshwater mussel lab, where they're actually breeding freshwater mussels, which they'll then, once they grow them up, they'll put them out in the river. But this is an introductory kind of lab where people can come in and see what's happening. And so you can learn about what the mussel is eating and how the mussel food web works, and just celebrating this beautiful architecture of diatoms. In this case, the colors I'm using are artistic license, but the forms are absolutely true to nature. And I'm working with scientists and educators to show these intricate food webs and to make a real visual story of this interconnectedness that we might otherwise just look at the river and see a flow of green and not have a sense of how much is going on inside the water. So I'm very interested in creating non-digital as well as digital ways of having interactions. In this case, doing rubbings on these sandblasted glass plates is hugely satisfying for people, and they're touching species that they would never touch in real life. So it's a way of getting people acquainted with these kind of somewhat we might call gross things, and they're starting to see them in a different scale and starting to understand them, a real up close view of this micro life and all the critters that are more familiar who eat them. And so the tiny and gross and squishy and scary things, when they're up close and personal, kind of are starting to make sense. And I always hope that people will feel a little more friendly towards these creatures and to where they live, and think about preserving those areas once they've gotten to know what's living there. Art has an extraordinary superpower, which is this being a tool for understanding change in the environment. I don't think we think about art and change all that often, but it's very flexible in its showing of before and after, or two different conditions like wet and dry, or night and day. And I feel really strongly that the art that's coming up now needs to be changeable and responsive, not sort of the older form of art where it sits on a pedestal and collects dust and is still and it's the same every time you go and see it. I'm really interested in art that's more like a verb and is always changing and can show change in nature, which is something that's very consistent about nature. It's always changing. So I've used art to show the tide cycle, so that you can see high tide versus low tide in the city. And I think that for cities that are living on tidal rivers, it's very important to become more and more aware of our tides, because as the seas rise and encroach upon our cities, it generates a kind of fear without understanding. And I think art can be a very strong tool to help you understand these natural processes, so you stop fearing them and you start to think about how you're going to live with them. And here's another project showing on a tidal river in Philadelphia, the Schuylkill River, showing the action of nature. So what I do is I look at the scientific charts to see where things are, but I don't want to stop at those charts. That's not enough for me to understand how tide works. It's not enough for me to translate it to someone who's driving along the local expressway. I want to make something where it registers the change over as the thing is actually processing. So I created a series of fields of strands of buoys. So at high tide, they're sticking up like this, and at half tide, they're arched over, and then at low tide, they're lying flat on the water surface. So when you're driving over this blue bridge, you can actually look out the window carefully and see where the tide is at any given time. That's something most people had no awareness that this river had a 6-foot tide that changed every 12 hours. So I think that's a really important thing to learn about things as you're driving by, jogging by, waiting for a bus, that these patterns are revealed to all of us in our everyday lives. This is another, you can see these buoys keep repeating over. They're wonderful to use, and I keep reusing them. But here's a project in Pittsburgh where art is addressing the river ecology. This is at the three rivers, where two rivers, the Allegheny and the Monongahela, join to become the Ohio. And there's a tremendous change in currents and what each river is bringing down. So art's able to introduce the two different sediment loads that are somewhat apparent in the different colors that are coming out of each of these rivers, but it really plays against that and also starts to show some other things. So each river is coming from a different watershed, different speeds and temperatures and sediment loads. And you can sort of watch the wind on the surface currents play with these buoys. and get very involved with that. But I also, when I set out to investigate one particular process that I want to sort of highlight or translate, I have to be fairly flexible because the lesson can change sometimes. And this was an example where I started with river currents, but I realized the real lesson that this piece showed was wave action. And waves, you may know this, are actually a series of things moving in place. They're not always moving towards you. And I remember standing at the shoreline with one of the funders, and I said, the water that's out there when it's coming, when there's a wave, the water that's out there isn't coming towards you, it's just circulating. And I remember she was absolutely stunned, as I had been. I thought that was the stuff that was coming from far away. So it's a way of understanding how things work, that things are moving up and down. You can see with my blue arrows, each of the buoys would show wave action. And it made me realize that a stadium wave where people get up and throw their hands up and then sit back down again is exactly as water is moving in the ocean, in a river. Anything that's creating a wave is circulating. So these buoys allowed that to become visible and sort of became a much better translation than me just standing there telling people that's not the same water. So registering the flow and giving to people a way to witness what the natural process is what the aim of these art forms are. And they do create diagrams. And it is to be remembered that art has always played a role in telling the story of natural phenomenon and has often been diagrammed. These weather maps of tornado studies were really wonderful, and it was a way of studying weather, of studying meteorology. And graphs and scientists looking at this information and trying to figure things out is really, really important, but it's not the only way to express natural processes. We have to sort of get away from the idea that charts are true and art is false in some ways, because art can make the graphs and the data come alive. And they can show change, the art can show change over time. So here's high water in the Bushkill after a storm. And the curtain, these buoys are showing these different patterns. So there's regular flow, and then a fast high water, and then slow high water. And you can see it. So it hangs down at a typical flow, and a flood comes through and the strands become a sort of C shape. And then after a big storm, when it's calm but still high, it becomes a kind of L shape when the water is high but the current is slow. So this is a project that registers the changing stream height. It starts to show you that when the change is happening, and allows you to walk across the bridge, look down and see if the water's high or low, and get a sense of how high and how much lower than before. And you can register that change because it's made so apparent. We're needing to understand what's happening with water, because water is one of the most vulnerable substances that we have. And we're going to be very beset by water in the next little while. We have a challenge with rising seas. We're having extended droughts and also extended flooding, along with aquifer depletion. So this idea that we really have to rethink how we're dealing with water may start with a kind of visualization, so that we can see where water is and what it's doing in our landscape. So this is where art becomes a really important tool for translating ecology into these legible forms, because we can understand parts of water that we weren't able to understand before, and we can deal a little more intelligently with them. I also like to create projects that get people down into the very places that the art is diagramming. And so these projects can become excellent vehicles for bringing people down to their local waterways, as we collect, in this case, from each tributary, from streams and from the Chesapeake Bay itself. This was a project that was in Towson University, just outside of Baltimore. And we're collecting water throughout the county, throughout the watershed. And it's a very cross-curriculum activity. Students and faculty from many different departments. All the science departments were there, from physics to biology. The engineering department was participating in art history. And then one of my favorites was the music department was also participating and taking recordings of each of the different kinds of streams. Some of them were in rural areas, some of them were under highways, and all the different places that water flowed. So we're carefully labeling our collection and pouring it into the map. And then there's this huge map, which is filled with actual samples of each tributary in its rightful place. So you get the sense of water quality, like where are streams wide and where are they narrow? And why is there a bridge there? Because it's the narrower place. And you can really sense water quality where some of the samples are quite clear and other samples are filled with suspended particulates. And it's a real study in the different qualities of water that are running through most of our watersheds, particularly if they're urban watersheds. So there's a watershed in a gallery that's been found. We've searched out the streams, collected the buckets of water, brought them back to the gallery, and then mapped them all out. And so this is a real convergence, because it's not only brought together all these different waters, but it's brought together all these different disciplines from the academic world of this university to all work together to make this map happen. And it's a great way to get to know how everyone's backyard stream flows into the next stream and then into the bay. And find where you live, find your watershed address. In this case, we also had a map where people wrote about their memories of different streams, and it was sort of like a love letters to the watershed. There's also a whole world of registering and witnessing the ghosts, I call them, the missing waterways, where the actual watersheds that used to be present and then got paved over and culverted and piped. This happened under our cities and under a great deal of farmland too. These ghost waterways that are no longer visible to us. And we live with the grid in our mind, not this dendritic pattern in our mind. But these waterways are going to come back to haunt us in many ways too, because they're still running, the streams are still running under the grid of the city. And usually they're quite tamely running under, but when there's flooding, these are the first areas that flood too. So a lot of urban pluvial from rain flooding is based on these historic creeks expanding out of their banks, which they should be doing. That's exactly what a stream is meant to do. But that's not what we anticipated when we put them in pipes and put a grid of city streets over the top. So I think that sort of reviving that swirling pattern of thinking about the water that once flowed there and is still flowing there. And if you put your ear to a manhole cover, you will hear it flowing that beyond the sewer water, you can hear the streams that have been captured by the pipes underneath. So before the concrete of the cities, the waterways flowed everywhere across our lands. The land was a much wetter place, a much soggier place. And if you come to next week's lecture, you'll hear a great deal about sogginess and how we have to regain the sogginess of our land in places as a way of living with rain. So we find these once soggy areas on historic maps, and with various clues like very tall street trees often connote that there's a stream underneath that street. And we remember them by painting it with this temporary paint, the passage that these streams once made through the city. And the clues are very interesting. One of the things that you can figure out that a stream had been flowing here and is now flowing under the concrete is things like sunny day puddles that never dry out because the stream is constantly reviving the puddle. This is on 64th Street in Manhattan, known as the Mosquito Block, because there's always standing water. And the residents of the street never knew why. And now they know there's a live stream flowing under their street. And it is along the edges of the city, the rising water of climate change are going to take back all of the paved shorelines, all of the fortified shorelines that we've created and bring them back into water. So what was once a wetland before we urbanized it, you can see the sort of the light blue stripe. There's a pink outline with a huge, that's where City Field is for baseball. So most of this land was wet and it's been dried out and paved and built up, and it will be wet again as sea level starts to rise. So I think having this temporary full-scale diagram gives people a sense of what was and what will be, and how climate change is going to change what our edges look like. That edge that we wanted so hard to delineate as either wet, we call it Flushing Bay, or dry, we call it the parking lot or the promenade, or whatever was made dry for our pleasure of living in a dry space, will become soggy again as the sea rises. And this is an area of the high tide in the future is going to really alter how New York looks. It's not going to be the same sort of either wet or dry. It's going to have a lot of wetness gradient. And that sense of inundation is something that we have to really have an understanding of. And it's a way of making climate crisis more visible, more place-based, more real, so that we can come to grips with it and with the solutions that we will have to come to, or maybe the whole sense that we're going to have to live with this new wetness. So we're going to have to design for it so that we can live with the wetness ourselves and with nature better than how we're doing it now with this heavy delineation between wet and dry. So I think that this is one of the ways that art can rebuild a relationship with nature and also show a way forward that this is going to last. So it's very important for us to stop thinking of ourselves as other, to not segregate ourselves from nature, and to sense nature as part of us. And if you think about the patterns, the dendritic patterns that are in trees, they're also the same patterns that are carrying blood inside our bodies. We are those patterns. So we are part of nature. It's the same pattern that is carrying all the river water throughout the land. And it's also, it happens at so many different scales. This is hoarfrost on a windshield that was, and it's the same pattern, large and small, very similar to the idea that the pattern of the vortices, that it's everywhere. And there are vortices in us. That's actually how our heart pumps, is by closure of the chambers through the pressure of the vortices of our blood moving in this swirling way. These patterns are really important, and to understand them, to have them translated for us, to have them made legible is a really important first step for us to gain a deeper relationship with nature and to understand that it's part of us. We are not separate. And so I feel that art's job right now is to make ecology legible and give us new ways, visual pathways, kinetic pathways, experiential pathways for understanding how nature works, so we don't feel so clueless and lost in our own backyard. And we can work to reestablish our connection to nature. So thank you very much. And I hope that you'll see part 2, which is about reestablishing that connection and then moving on to working and living happily with nature by sharing better with it. So thank you so much. And I can take all sorts of questions, large and small, and you can flip over to the question end of things.
If you would all like to put your questions in the chat, then I can read them off just to make things a little bit easier for everyone. We already have a question from Marcia. Marcia says, your projects are lovely. How do you initiate your ideas, and with whom? And what are the avenues of funding that are available to support these projects? And this is a lovely, like, little like teaser we can give people for the workshop that you'll be hosting on May 5th, which I feel like you'll be exploring those issues even more.
Right. We'll get down to the brass tacks of that. Some of these projects are percent for art. Some of these projects, which are where a percent, usually 0.5% actually, is set aside for art, the other half is for administration. When there's construction on a, in different states have different requirements. It can be a sewer project. Seattle is very good with having any municipal or federal infrastructure project is 1% of it is given towards art, which is based in the same site. Some of these are with the museums that commission them for indoors or outdoors, and galleries do that too. Some of them are commissioned by the scientific entities, such as the Freshwater Mussel Lab is commissioned by the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary. So that's a bunch of scientists who were trying to create this lab, and they wanted to have a stronger expression of what was going on there for the visitors to really understand and to celebrate the process that they were very familiar with, but most people aren't at all familiar with the life cycle of a freshwater mussel. So it's quite variable how these projects are funded. Some of them have rather large budgets, $400,000, $450,000. Some of them have very small budgets. The rapid painting on the streets in New York and Brooklyn are a couple $100s to do. So I like to run a gambit of prices and timescales too. Some of my work is permanent for 50 years, and some of it lasts until the next rainstorm. And I like the flexibility that gives me to work with different materials and to think on different timescales.
Wonderful. Does anyone else have any questions? They're free to add them to the chat, or you can unmute. Oh, here we go. Donna Webb asks, have you observed instances of scientists inviting artists to work as part of their research group?
Yes, that does happen. It happens a lot more with Arctic scientists who are studying happenings in the Arctic. There's a lot more institutional support for those collaborations. When I am working, I usually find my scientists and start working with them because they're working in something that I want to show, and so I will locate them myself and initiate a relationship. There are some clearinghouses that sort of are matchmaking scientists with artists. I don't have. I will have that together for the last lecture. I'll have some of those as possibilities to show, though I haven't used them myself, but I think it's a really great idea. And I know that scientists are often totally into this idea, like, I'd love to work with artists, but how would I even start to do that? But I think anyone who is an artist should feel emboldened to invite a scientist to work with them, and vice versa. Anyone who's a scientist should do the same and invite an artist. It's like ranchers dance with the farmers' daughters, farmers dance with the ranchers' cows of Oklahoma. It's a world now where our disciplines are becoming absurd, like the delineation of our disciplines, just like the idea that wet is wet and dry is dry, which turns out not to be true in most natural areas. It's mostly somewhere in between. It's very important that different pathways of thinking join together in a collaborative effort to rethink how we're going to go forward, because we've gotten this far, but we haven't done it particularly well. There's a lack of finesse about our relationship to nature that needs to be addressed. And I think that everyone who is whatever kind of work you're doing, if you're an engineer, you should be reaching out to people who are thinking differently than you are and collaborate with them, because the thinking that comes out of two different minds contemplating the same problem is far more interesting than what you generate yourself. So it seems like one of the big shifts in art today is that artists are stepping out to work with other disciplines, and I'm hoping that the other disciplines are going to become equally open to work with artists.
I actually have a question for you, because you did such a beautiful job of acknowledging the, indigenous land that you live on. How do you approach ensuring the acknowledgement of those who came first in your work? It's so hard, and they're too often forgotten about in all of this, our Native Americans. And I'd just love to hear how you approach that as you kind of map out a project.
Right. Well, mapping is the key word there. When I'm working on maps, I'm able to dig up the history, and because I'm residing in an area where the indigenous populations were wiped out by disease and deforestation, and just being basically driven out of these areas. So the indigenous populations here don't exist really, or they're not existing separately in tribal lands the way upstate New York has tribal lands. But I think that seeing what the cities that we inhabit were like and how they were seen from another perspective, another human perspective, is really important to bring into our understanding, as well as how you see it from another species perspective too. So I'm often balancing, sort of seeing it from a natural history perspective and a cultural history perspective. And sometimes there are ways to put that in. When I'm mapping on stone, I'm doing a lot of research with what these places were called before they became anglicized. And I'm looking at like how the rivers and streams also changed over time. And that is part of that history of industrialization and sort of the driving out of indigenous people. So that's of interest to me. But a lot of my work is mostly looking at natural processes and what nature is doing on the site. That's sort of, I need to start somewhere, and that's where I'm starting with.
Susan Danko asks, what brought you to, she says, Cleveland and Northeast Ohio in general, and are you planning a project here?
I'm not planning a project at this point, but I'm always open to projects everywhere. And it's a very interesting part of the world, and your adjacency to a national park is extremely interesting to me too.
Deborah says, I love your work. I'm wondering if you have considered a project involving the Underground Railroad.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I have not. No, I haven't. I haven't worked with human history that much. I tend to work with natural history, but it's a very interesting thing. And I grew up in Philadelphia, so the Underground Railroad was really a very strong part of my awareness of houses and which houses had been on the Underground Railroad in and around Philadelphia. So it's something I'm personally fascinated by. And the idea of sanctuary is something that's extremely dear to me. But I think I've translated that for myself as a sanctuary for other species too.
We seem to have one more question, unless anybody wants to follow this, from Donna Webb. I went to a presentation by the National Science Foundation a few years ago and asked the presenters if artists were ever included in the collaborative groups. They seemed genuinely confused and said that this did not happen. So it was not a question, it was just a comment to your previous question. So great to see you doing this work, and thank you.
That's good. And I get that sometimes too from scientists, but I have found non-scientists often, when I talk about collaborating with scientists, say, well, you as an artist, you're dealing with just fairy dust, and scientists are dealing with truth. And I find I can dispute that, because I'm always doing a lot of research to figure out how things are working and where, and how the very site specific qualities to the processes that I'm looking into. So I feel like a strong kindred spirit with science, scientists. We're really, twins, excuse me. And we work in a very similar way of starting with curiosity and exploring the world, the world that we both love. So we work together well.
Well, thank you so much, Stacy. This was absolutely wonderful. And we're so lucky to have you coming back next Wednesday at 6 p.m. as well for your conversation entitled How Art Works. And we encourage you all, most people have registered for both events, but if you haven't registered for that, we encourage you to go on to Eventbrite and do that. I'll put that link in the chat here. And please also take a moment to fill out the survey that we have included in the chat as well. That helps us with the future event planning and anything like that. So with that, I just want to say thank you on behalf of all of us, Stacy, and Summit County in Northeast Ohio. It's just a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming. I appreciate it. And I hope some of you will come next week to see how, to see a sort of different angle about finding solutions and how we can live better with nature.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.